love to, know from or understand a bit from you how education has progressed. Because obviously what we're talking about right now in 2021 is very different from when I entered the industry in like 2011. I mean, it was night and day different. Now I can only imagine what it was like in the early 2000s, because ultimately your dad was fighting an uphill battle the entire time, and
Since
probably, and
1970, since 1970, my
I'm
father.
sure in mainstream communities, ostracized, and ultimately, as an outsider, or at least, you're fighting it's like David versus Goliath. It's a tough battle to fight, and luckily, he stuck with it, and I'm sure that there's been not only that, tons of sacrifices, socially, sacrifices between, with your freedoms ultimately, because I've no doubt that your dad has been harassed. I don't know the entire history, but I can only
He's
imagine.
been in jail many dozens of times.
Yeah, brutal. And it's brutal that we're still putting people in jail today
Yeah.
for something that is legal, and is, with giant corporations trying to become the Walmarts of pot.
Well, we're still thinking we have to be careful with the term legal, because it is allowed more than it's legal. In
Sure.
states, it's allowed. The federal government says that it's still illegal, so technically, it's still illegal. But the ostracized to be ostracized to be ostracized
Hey,
from
you were struggling with
from
that just like I was struggling
from
with heroin.
mainstream society was not the only place of discrimination that my father faced. Um, in the 70s, as my father became more vocal and more ever present in being an activist and an educator, uh, he was ostracized from the cannabis movement in general. The folks from Normal discarded and dismissed my father quite easily. They thought my father's views on cannabis and hemp were so extreme that it was bad for cannabis. It was bad for marijuana smokers when Normal was looking to defend, um, folks who were being arrested and sentenced for cannabis possession or sales or transportation. That my father's views that this was the plant that was the safest non-toxic substance known to mankind, and that by embracing cannabis and hemp to its full utility, we would not only be able to to save the world, reverse the greenhouse effect, change economic well-being for folks around the globe. This was so uh, extreme that even the folks that were defending cannabis users from prosecution, my father was being removed from its conversation because his views were seen to be too radical.
Wow.
And my father, in a sense, um, he doubled down. He was like, no, if you're not thinking about all things cannabis and all things hemp and how these things interact and how its understanding is, if you're not really embracing the truth of cannabis, then you are yourself buying into the same fact that prohibition, is this thing that we have to deal with forever. If your only idea is to decriminalize it, that you're on the wrong footing. And if you're not looking to legalize cannabis and its use and its production and its distribution and its consumption, if you're not looking to bring people out of prison based on decades old prosecutions and incarcerations, if you're not looking to reverse all of the damage that the war on drugs and the demonization of cannabis was doing, if you weren't looking to get every single person out of jail that has been incarcerated, then you're already on the wrong side of history. And they didn't want to hear that. And when he published the book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes, in 1985, when you talk about education, suddenly here was this book that depicts in crystal clear delineations of how the demonization of cannabis started, who was profiting from it, who benefited from it, and who were the subjects of persecution. And that was just one aspect of what this book was, because and then it also brings in all of its history and all of its use and all of its importance throughout history. And this book in 1985 started to be read by a few thousand people in the San Fernando Valley, where the book was originally written and published, to then being sold around the Grateful Dead tours and parking lots, and then it started to go into some colleges and universities as historical texts. Then it started to be really passed around through the cannabis community at large, because it was the first time that people were able to see real documentation of how this plant was used, how important it was to all civilizations, not just those who wanted to smoke cannabis, but those who wanted to use this plant to its full utility, and really how disruptive the technology of cannabis could be to all new, or all of these industries that have been producing products since the advent of petroleum based products and processes. And this book kind of really gave everybody an understanding of, not only was this plant safe, but it was extraordinarily useful. And that really started to change the narrative. But that narrative changed after Proposition 215 passed, the Compassionate Care Act in 1996. And for the first time, we had some level of accessible cannabis without persecution in the state of California. And once that happened, people were able to go into a dispensary or into a compassionate care facility and get their cannabis. And as the years started to pass after that, people stopped fighting for changes in laws, because they're like, oh, cannabis is legal. And people were just like, oh, how do we get legal cannabis into this state? And all they were looking for was a place to call home, whether it was Colorado, or whether it was Washington, or whether it was Alaska, where new medicinal access was available. And as people were getting their cannabis through these facilities, their fight for cannabis's overall freedom started to change. Their understanding of its history started to be forgotten in some sense, because they didn't have to fight anymore. So why should they have to learn about hemp? Why should they have to learn about cannabis? And so there's been like this steady almost decline in its true understanding and its participation in our future, not just our past. And now we're coming back to the point where all of these great advancements in the access of cannabis and hemp, and all of the products that are now starting to be used, whether it's clothing or new plastics or new opportunities, 3D printing, new battery technology, new home building technologies, all of these things are now becoming more important and more sought after in new industry startups. And now people are actually going back to the education side of this, and going back to the Emperor Wears No Clothes, and really looking at this information as it's almost like it's all new all over again. And 35 years after the book has been written, it is becoming as popular today as it was back in 1985, 1990, 1995. And we're still only talking mostly about people in the cannabis or hemp industries that are reading this book. And what we need to do is that the information that's in this book needs to get out to the wider audience, to those who hear about the developments and the access and new farms growing in their states, or new opportunities. And instead of them just accepting the fact that this is the way that the future is going to go, and that governments are going to allow cannabis and hemp to be grown in their neighborhoods, that now they can actually have an understanding that this is more than just something that people can use recreationally or medically when they're driving their Mercedes Benz or their BMWs that have been made since the early 2000s, or Mercedes Benz since 2009. Many of their interior automobile parts are made from cannabis today. Their dashboards, their door panels, there's more than 100 different parts in today's automobiles, mostly from Europe, that are being made from the cannabis plant and cannabis technologies. And these are the things that these people need to know. They need to know that it's not just the thing that their kids or that their grandparents are using medicinally or even recreationally, but it's actually the parts that are surrounding them, keeping them even safer, making their cars even better, making the products that we use and touch every single day all that much more biodegradable and ecologically friendly. And that this greater understanding is going to continue to happen through the education of this book and through shows like yours. And it's really an extraordinary time that we're starting to get back into a more educated consumer, a more educated public, but there's still a lot of work to do.